A severed head, a gruesome spectacle, might retain consciousness for a fleeting 30 seconds post-decapitation, a horrifying final half-minute where the eyes flicker, lips twitch in a silent plea, and awareness clings as life ebbs away. For Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife, and arguably history's most infamous beheaded queen, this chilling possibility was but one layer of a brutal end, often glossed over in sanitized accounts. The truth of Anne's last days unveils a psychological torment far exceeding a mere sword stroke, a meticulously crafted political performance designed to obliterate not just her physical form, but her very essence. Her execution stands as a grim monument to Tudor England's merciless justice, where death served as the crescendo of a carefully orchestrated campaign of humiliation. While history books often summarize her demise as a beheading for treason, the reality paints a picture of psychological dismantling so calculated it would impress even modern practitioners of torture. Her execution wasn't simply an ending, it was the final act in Henry VIII's relentless quest to erase a woman whose power and influence had become an unbearable threat to his reign. By May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn had already endured 17 days of agonizing imprisonment within the Tower of London, the very fortress where she had once luxuriated in the excitement of preparing for her coronation. Just 3 years prior, she had been crowned Queen of England in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey, a moment of triumph forever etched in the annals of history. Now she languished in a strange and terrifying limbo, her execution repeatedly postponed as Henry VIII prolonged her psychological agony with calculated cruelty. The king had even gone to the chilling extent of summoning an expert swordsman from Calais to carry out the execution rather than employing the traditional English axe, a detail often romanticized as an act of mercy. This decision merely amplified the theatrical and performative nature of what was to come. During her final hours, Anne displayed an almost unnerving calm, described by witnesses as even cheerful as she prepared for her impending doom. Modern psychologists might identify this as dissociation, a psychological defense mechanism triggered by unimaginable trauma. She reportedly quipped that she would be known as enceinte, displaying a dark gallows humor that likely masked a maelstrom of inner turmoil. Too few historical narratives acknowledge the sheer terror she must have felt, knowing that her reputation was being systematically demolished through manufactured accusations of adultery, incest, and conspiracy to assassinate the king. What renders Anne's execution particularly appalling is not simply the physical act of beheading, but the calculated and relentless dismantling of her identity and agency. Henry's goal extended far beyond Anne's death. He sought to expunge her from history, invalidate her contributions, and delegitimize her daughter Elizabeth. The execution was the culmination of a carefully orchestrated character assassination campaign intended to justify to the English populace why their once beloved queen deserved such a brutal end. In the days preceding her death, Anne was forced to endure lurid, fabricated tales of her supposed sexual depravity, accusations so preposterous they would be immediately dismissed by any contemporary court. The morning of May 19th dawned unusually bright for London, a stark and cruel contrast to the dark events about to unfold. Anne had spent her final night in prayer, though sleep repeatedly eluded her grasp. Tower records reveal that she requested the sacrament at 2 o'clock in the morning, kneeling before the consecrated host for hours in desperate communion with the divine. By dawn, she had already been awake for almost a full day, her mind undoubtedly fractured by the immense stress and crippling exhaustion. When the Tower lieutenant arrived to escort her, she was reportedly laughing with her ladies-in-waiting, a reaction that speaks not of inner peace, but rather to a severe psychological breakdown. Anne's execution had been scheduled and rescheduled multiple times, a chilling and often overlooked form of psychological torture. The agonizing uncertainty of not knowing precisely when death would strike was a deliberate tactic deployed against prisoners, designed to maximize their fear and break their spirit. When finally informed that the hour had arrived, Anne was led from her chambers through corridors where, a mere 3 years earlier, she had processed as queen, basking in the adoration of the crowds. Now guards flanked her not out of respect or reverence, but to prevent any desperate attempt at escape. The same courtiers who had once bowed deeply before her now watched her final walk with calculated indifference, their eyes betraying a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. The scaffold, erected on Tower Green, was notably low, standing just 3 feet above the ground, a departure from the towering platforms often depicted in dramatic films. This deliberate design choice forced Anne to ascend only a few steps, stripping her of the dignity of elevation and keeping her closer to the jeering gaze of the assembled crowd. While modern representations often portray a solemn and respectful gathering, historical accounts suggest that a carnival-like atmosphere had been actively encouraged. The execution served as public theater, a stark warning to anyone who dared to challenge the king's authority, particularly women who presumed to rise above their allotted station. Before kneeling at the block, Anne was permitted a final speech, not out of compassion or fairness, but because tradition demanded it. Her carefully measured words revealed both her sharp political acumen and her desperate, precarious circumstances. "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, for according to the law and by the law, I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it." This apparent submission to her fate was, in fact, her ultimate act of rebellion. By acknowledging the law while pointedly refraining from admitting guilt, she subtly challenged the very legitimacy of the charges against her. Perhaps most disturbingly, the king himself was conspicuously absent. Unlike the popular image of royal executions, Henry VIII did not attend. Instead, he waited anxiously at Whitehall Palace for confirmation of Anne's death. Even as the sword severed her head from her body, Henry was reportedly celebrating his upcoming marriage to Jane Seymour, a callous and brutal testament to how utterly discarded Anne had become. The personal had become irrevocably intertwined with the political, and Anne's death was reduced to an inconvenient necessity in the king's ruthless pursuit of a male heir. The swordsman from Calais, specifically chosen and handsomely compensated for his expertise, represented yet another level of calculated cruelty. Traditional English beheadings employed an axe, which often required multiple blows to completely sever the head. The French swordsman, while more likely to achieve decapitation in a single, swift stroke, was a complete stranger to Anne. In her final moments, she was forced to face death at the hands of an unfamiliar executioner, a final indignity heaped upon a queen who had once commanded the unwavering attention of all England. Her blindfolding, often presented as an act of mercy to spare her the sight of the approaching sword, actually served a more pragmatic purpose, preventing her from flinching at the crucial moment, which could result in a gruesome, botched execution. Anne knelt upright rather than placing her head on a block, another French tradition that heightened the executioner's challenge. This position forced Anne to maintain stillness through sheer force of will, preserving her composure even as the swordsman prepared to strike. Witnesses reported that she continuously moved her lips in silent prayer, her eyes darting anxiously beneath the blindfold as she strained to detect any sound of the approaching blade. The psychological torment of this agonizing moment, knowing that death approaches but not knowing precisely when, represents a particularly insidious form of torture rarely acknowledged in sanitized historical accounts. The actual beheading was impressively clean by the brutal standards of Tudor England. A single decisive stroke severed Anne's head, but what transpired immediately afterwards is often omitted from polite historical narratives. According to eyewitness accounts, her eyes and lips continued to move for several seconds after decapitation, a horrifying physiological response that occurs when oxygen remains in the brain tissue. Some accounts even suggest that her lips formed words, perhaps continuing the prayer interrupted by the sword's deadly blow. The sight was so profoundly disturbing that several witnesses fainted, while others turned away in horror at this ghastly reminder of the tenuous connection between body and soul. Perhaps most tellingly, no proper coffin had been prepared for Anne's remains. Her distraught ladies-in-waiting, overcome with grief and horror, had to frantically search for an arrow chest in which to place her head and body. This seemingly minor oversight speaks volumes about the utter disregard for Anne's dignity, even in death. She was treated as an afterthought, a political problem solved rather than a human being deserving of basic funerary respect. She was hastily buried in an unmarked grave within the Tower Chapel without proper Christian ceremony, as though the king hoped that her memory would fade as swiftly as her life had ended. Henry's determination to erase Anne extended far beyond her physical death. Court painters received explicit instructions to destroy her portraits, erasing her image from the visual record. Her royal emblems were painstakingly chiseled from palace walls, and courtiers quickly learned that even mentioning her name could incur royal disfavor. While we often fixate on the physical act of execution, this systematic elimination of Anne's very existence represents a profound form of violence that transcended her death, an attempt to execute not just a person, but a legacy. It would be centuries before historians began the painstaking work of reconstructing Anne's life from the fragments that survived Henry's ruthless purge. Anne's execution also deeply traumatized those forced to witness it, particularly her loyal ladies-in-waiting, who were tasked with the gruesome duty of cleaning and preparing her severed head before burial. These women, themselves terrified of being implicated in the Queen's alleged crimes, had to perform this horrifying task while struggling to maintain composure. Several reportedly suffered from recurring nightmares for years afterwards, and at least one eventually sought refuge in a convent, unable to continue with court life after witnessing such unspeakable horror. The ripple effects of psychological trauma extended far beyond Anne herself, creating a pervasive climate of fear that permeated Henry's court for the remainder of his reign. In the immediate aftermath of the execution, Anne's daughter Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, was declared illegitimate and removed from the line of succession. The child who would one day become England's greatest queen was effectively orphaned, her mother executed, and her father publicly denouncing her legitimacy. Court records reveal that Elizabeth was suddenly deprived of proper clothing and attendance appropriate to her former status. Her household dissolved almost overnight. This cruel treatment of a toddler represents yet another horrifying dimension of Anne's execution. The punishment extended even to her innocent child. Most modern depictions of Tudor executions fail to capture the overwhelming sensory experience. The scaffold would have reeked of the blood from previous executions, attracting swarms of flies in the May warmth. The crowd's roar, often manipulated by planted supporters instructed to cheer the Queen's death, created a disorienting wall of sound designed to terrify and demoralize. Anne would have heard this cacophony growing louder as she approached Tower Green, a constant reminder of her impending doom. The jeers and catcalls from a population encouraged to view her as a witch and adulteress. This carefully orchestrated public humiliation formed an essential and brutal component of Tudor justice. Death alone was never considered punishment enough. Popular culture often romanticizes Anne's final speech as a moment of dignified defiance, but historical records suggest a far more nuanced and constrained reality. Her carefully worded address, praising the king as a gentle and sovereign lord, reflects the impossible position she occupied. Even facing certain death, Anne could not speak freely or truthfully. Her words were undoubtedly shaped by concern for her daughter's future and the anticipated reaction of the watching crowd. Her speech represents not true freedom of expression, but its tragic opposite, the ultimate censorship of a woman who knew that even her final words would be meticulously reported to the king and could have dire consequences for those she left behind. The sword that ended Anne's life, specially imported from France, symbolizes the performative aspect of her execution. Henry spared no expense to ensure a spectacle worthy of a queen's downfall. The executioner himself reportedly practiced on animals beforehand, determined to achieve the clean, single stroke that would secure his substantial fee. This cold professionalism, the reduction of Anne's death to a mere technical challenge, exemplifies the dehumanization inherent in state-sanctioned execution. Anne wasn't simply killed, she was processed through a system designed to transform human suffering into a potent form of political messaging. Contemporary accounts record that no English executioner would perform the task, not out of any moral objection, but because the French sword technique required specialized training and expertise. The blade itself was razor-sharp and weighted differently than an English axe, designed for a swift horizontal strike rather than the downward chop of an axe. This seemingly minor technical detail underscores the theatrical and performative nature of Anne's execution. Even the method of death was meticulously selected for maximum visual impact and minimum messiness, ensuring that the spectacle would proceed without the unseemly complications of a botched beheading. After the sword fell, witness Thomas Wyatt, himself imprisoned in the Tower and forced to watch the execution of a woman he had once admired, wrote of the little throat that had had so many jewels hung about it. His poignant lament captures the grotesque transformation of Anne from a crowned queen to an objectified corpse. The severed head was immediately wrapped in linen by her weeping ladies-in-waiting, but not before the executioner held it aloft by the hair, a traditional gesture meant to demonstrate the completed sentence to the assembled crowd. This chilling moment of public display, with blood still pumping from the severed arteries, served as the climactic visual that would forever imprint itself on the memories of those who witnessed it. Tower records indicate that Anne's remains were buried so hastily that proper Christian burial rites were abbreviated almost to non-existence. The arrow chest containing her head and body was placed beneath the chapel floor among other executed nobles, an ignominious end for a crowned Queen of England. No marker was placed to indicate her grave location, and for centuries her exact burial spot remained shrouded in mystery. This erasure of even her final resting place represents the culmination of Henry's relentless campaign to remove Anne not just from life, but from history itself, a campaign that very nearly succeeded. In the days following the execution, Henry's propagandists worked diligently to shape the official public narrative. Court poets who had once lauded Anne's wit and beauty now penned verses condemning her as a scheming adulteress. Official accounts emphasized the king's supposed mercy in providing a skilled swordsman rather than the traditional axe, recasting Henry's theatrical choice as an act of compassionate consideration. The execution's inherent horror was systematically sanitized in official records, marking the beginning of a centuries-long process of historical revision that continues to influence our understanding of Anne's final moments to this day. Perhaps most disturbing to modern sensibilities is the remarkable speed with which life returned to normal for Henry VIII. The very day after Anne's execution, he became formally engaged to Jane Seymour. Within 2 weeks of sending his second wife to the scaffold, Henry married his third in a quiet ceremony at Whitehall Palace. This callous haste reveals the execution as nothing more than a convenient solution to a complex political problem. Anne had failed to produce a male heir, so she was ruthlessly eliminated and replaced. The personal tragedy of her death was completely subordinated to the demands of statecraft and dynasty building. The psychological dimension of Anne's execution extended far beyond the scaffold. For weeks preceding her death, she had been subjected to relentless questioning, denied proper sleep, and systematically isolated from her friends and supporters. Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister who masterminded the charges against her, employed techniques remarkably similar to modern psychological torture: disorientation, sleep deprivation, social isolation, and the strategic dissemination of false information. By the time Anne reached the scaffold, she had already endured a carefully orchestrated campaign of mental and emotional breakdown designed to ensure that she would offer no problematic final resistance. Court records reveal the extraordinary security measures implemented for Anne's execution, far exceeding what was standard practice for even high-ranking traitors. The Tower garrison was doubled, and special guards were strategically positioned throughout the fortress complex. These precautions were not primarily designed to prevent a daring escape attempt. Rather, they were intended to ensure that no loyal supporter could attempt a last-minute intervention or rally public sentiment against the execution. The overwhelming show of force served another important purpose too, intimidating any who might sympathize with Anne into silent compliance with the king's will. The timing of the execution, scheduled for mid-morning rather than the traditional dawn, allowed for maximum attendance by London citizens. Tower Green could only accommodate a limited audience of nobility and officials, but the Tower's elevated profile meant that large crowds gathered outside could easily hear the announcement of its completion. Church bells throughout London would then signal the precise moment of death, creating a citywide acknowledgement of royal power. This deliberate orchestration transformed Anne's private suffering into a highly public performance, death as a form of political theater rather than a deeply personal tragedy. Among the most overlooked aspects of Anne's execution is the tragic fate of her co-accused. 5 men, including her own brother George Boleyn, were executed just days before Anne on fabricated charges of adultery with the Queen. Their deaths serve to establish the purported facts of Anne's alleged crimes before her own execution, preventing any possibility that their final speeches might contradict the official narrative. This coordinated judicial murder of 6 individuals, all convicted on essentially identical fabricated evidence, represents one of Tudor England's most brazen acts of state-sponsored violence, a purge comparable to Stalin's infamous show trials centuries later. While Tower Green today features a memorial marking the approximate site of Anne's execution, contemporary records indicate that the actual scaffold stood elsewhere within the Tower complex. This geographical confusion is emblematic of how Anne's death has been repeatedly reframed and relocated, both physically and historically, to serve differing and evolving narratives. The sanitized, romanticized version of her execution found in popular culture bears little resemblance to the pervasive psychological warfare, relentless character assassination, and calculated cruelty that characterized her final days in May of 1536. The true horror of Anne Boleyn's execution lies not just in the physical act of beheading, but in understanding it as the culmination of a comprehensive and meticulously planned campaign to destroy a woman who had risen too high for the stifling confines of Tudor society. She was not merely executed, she was systematically unmade, her reputation destroyed beyond repair, her achievements nullified, and her very existence almost completely erased from the historical record. When we examine the full context of her final days, the pervasive psychological torture, the deliberate public humiliation, the calculated theatricality, and the attempted erasure of her memory, we confront a horror far more disturbing than the swift stroke of a Calais sword. From a modern psychological perspective, Anne's execution represents a compelling case study in state-sanctioned gaslighting and relentless public character assassination. The charges leveled against her, ranging from adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, to conspiring to poison the king, were so outlandish that they would never stand up in any contemporary court of law. Yet, through the careful manipulation of public opinion, the strategic use of torture to extract coerced confessions from co-accused men, and the iron-fisted control of all official narratives, Henry's government successfully convinced a significant portion of the populace that Anne deserved her horrific fate. This systematic manipulation of reality itself constitutes perhaps the most chilling and horrifying aspect of her execution. 5 centuries later, Anne Boleyn's execution continues to captivate and fascinate us precisely because it represents the tragic intersection of personal destruction and ruthless political calculation. Her death was not simply the end of a life, but a carefully orchestrated performance designed to justify a king's actions and reshape historical memory to his liking. The true horror lies not in the precise moment the sword fell, but in recognizing how completely absolute power can rewrite reality to suit its own purposes, a lesson that resonates uncomfortably in our own era of rampant information manipulation and widespread character assassination. Anne's ultimate tragedy may be that, despite Henry's most determined efforts to erase her from memory, her death, rather than her remarkable life, became her most enduring legacy, a dark stain on the Tudor dynasty. In fully understanding the true horror of Anne Boleyn's execution, we confront uncomfortable truths about the dynamics of power, the insidious nature of gender bias, and the complex construction of historical narrative. The sanitized version of her death, an unfortunate queen meeting a quick, dignified end, serves only to obscure the systematic abuse of state power that her case so starkly represents. By closely examining the psychological dimensions of her execution, the calculated torments, the deliberate public humiliation, the methodical destruction of her reputation, and the attempted erasure of her very memory, we gain invaluable insight, not just into the brutal realities of Tudor justice, but into how authority maintains and perpetuates itself through the control of both bodies and narratives. In Anne's severed head, we find a chilling warning about the fragility of truth itself when confronted with the overwhelming force of absolute power. So, when we truly delve into Anne Boleyn's final days, we see a story far more complex and disturbing than the simple narrative of a queen losing her head. It's a chilling tale of calculated cruelty, psychological torment, and the ruthless manipulation of history itself. It's a reminder that power, unchecked, can rewrite reality and erase individual lives in the pursuit of its own agenda. Anne's execution wasn't just an ending, it was a brutal testament to the lengths those in power will go to silence dissent and control the narrative. What are your thoughts on Anne Boleyn's story? Did anything in particular resonate with you? Leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your perspective and discuss this further. And if you found this exploration insightful, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future deep dives into history's most fascinating and often unsettling stories.